This lesson is predominantly coming from this section of the Bible shown in the highlighted section of this chart. Lesson 30, Between the Testaments. We now come to a period known as the Intertestamental period. This was a period that elapsed between the last events and words of the Old Testament and the first events and words of the New Testament. Although God did not add any new revelation during this time, He was behind the scenes moving players and events on the world stage, getting things ready for the beginning of His great entrance into history as the Messiah, Jesus Christ. In our last lesson, we talked about the many nations that threatened and some that attacked Israel during the monarchical period of Israel's Old Testament history. From the very first returning Jews to their homeland after their 70-year Babylonian captivity, the Old Testament describes the situation of the Jews for about 100 more years, rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the city of Jerusalem, and trying to get those returnees back on course, serving God properly. The Old Testament ends roughly about 430 BC, giving no more detail of world history before the start of the New Testament. For that reason, that period between the Old Testament and the New Testament is commonly referred to as the 400 silent years. During that intertestamental period, the Macedonian or Grecian Empire emerged around 323 BC, led by Alexander, who conquered all the areas shaded on this map, including Israel. Alexander spread the Greek language and culture all throughout his Macedonian Empire. This unified and strengthened the empire, as all the different people could communicate with each other using the official language rather than their own native languages, making it easier to perform all civil functions such as education, business, and health. This would go a long way in spreading the gospel when the New Testament started. In fact, the entire New Testament was written in Greek, not Hebrew like the Old Testament, and therefore most citizens would be able to read it and understand the preaching of the gospel. Using the ambition of Alexander, God was putting in place one of the elements needed for the future spreading of the gospel, namely a common language. As powerful and ingenious as some political leaders are, they are just instruments in the hands of God as He merely uses them to accomplish His perfect will. After Alexander died, a tumultuous time of Jewish persecution ensued, causing many Jews to flee to other parts of the empire. Settling in little communities scattered around the empire, they started and built small synagogues where they could teach their own people about the scriptures to pass on their faith to their younger generations. The knowledge of the one true God was spread around the empire, and some Gentiles converted to Judaism, becoming proselyte Jews. We are now about 250 BC, still very far from the beginning of the New Testament. Around 146 BC, a new power started to arise from the west, and soon became the Roman Empire, which eventually grew and controlled all the territory in the shaded area of this map. As you can see, this included the area which has become known as Palestine, which included the nation of Israel. So, the Roman Empire encompassed all the land surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. God used the Romans to put in place another element needed for the spread of the gospel, namely, a great infrastructure. The Romans built roads, bridges, aqueducts, and provided order, security, and safety throughout the empire, greatly improving transportation, paving the way for the spread of the gospel. The stage is now set for the arrival of Jesus Christ. Roman policy was that the Romans would not tolerate rebellion against Rome. Refusing allegiance to the emperor, trying to become a king, or refusing to pay taxes would be met with the punishment of crucifixion. The Romans were very tolerant of the religions of other nations and cultures that they dominated. When Christianity started, the Romans thought that they were just a new sect of Judaism, and at first did not consider them a threat. The initial persecution against the church was carried out by the Jews, not the Romans. The Jewish religious leaders would accuse the Christians of treason and treachery to the Romans, and that is how the Romans began to persecute the Christians. We now need to look at the religious aspect of the people during this period. Around 250 BC, all the scriptures up to that time, which we call the Old Testament, was translated into Greek, and that version of the scriptures was called the Septuagint. Because of the complicated political wars and strife after the breakup of Alexander's Macedonian or Grecian Empire, the office of the high priest wound up taking on political power, making allegiances many times with the kings and governors of the different districts of Palestine. New Jewish offices and religious parties evolved at least 125 years before Christ. These included the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Scribes, and the Sanhedrin. These were various religious groups or sects that controlled the people by perverting and twisting the law of Moses. The Pharisees, for example, developed a system of regulations and traditions which by the time of Christ had become a terrible burden on the people. They viewed themselves as superior to the rest of society. They would often accuse Jesus of breaking the law of Moses, when in fact it was their traditions that Jesus was breaking, not the law of Moses. In our next lesson, we will look at the review of the Old Testament and see why the Old Testament contains very important information for properly understanding the New Testament and the words of Christ. Don't miss our next lesson. Until next time, goodbye for now.